And I didn't bring my 1958 high-tech scheme because I like to establish my credentials, because I know people who come to England think this is the home of high-tech, but it's the home I left in 1962. I'm a kind of ex-high-tech man, but it's a long time ago. I'm going to have to go quite fast because we're running a bit late, I think. If you can hang on till the end, you'll get to London. So we start with a primordial landscape. Would you like to change things, or shall I press the buttons? Or, oh, great. Oh, this is perfect, right. Okay. Right. Is that going to stretch? Yep. Right. I haven't got my rubber band. Has anybody got a rubber band? Ah.
This one's not connected to it.
Oh dear. Or a bit of sticky tape? No? No, never mind. Okay. This is the invention of fire. I mean, I won't spend too much time on lots of these. Something's not working. No, one of them is... There's a... Okay. And this is Narcissus, who Derrida says is the first painter. Couldn't stop looking at himself. And so I just want to establish some images of a kind of primordial landscape. And in this primordial landscape, one would have a certain kind of building, really, which we needn't give a name to, really. This was after I finished my high-tech in 1962. I went into neoclassicism. This is 1971. And this was a scheme for a museum, which they'd have had to sell the collection for to build, I think. It's the Borough Museum. So we've established this landscape, and then we've established a certain kind of building on it. Now, what interests me about cities, I mean, in a way, high-tech is almost the opposite of what I'm interested in. So I've gone through a complete inversion, you see. I'm going to try to explain what it is that I try to do when I design in cities. I was explaining this to an Italian girl, and so she told me that mud is called fango, and berries is called inglobati. But what it is I find in the cities that interest me is that these primordial buildings, these sort of temples which sit in the primordial landscape, and they're the dwellings of the kind of mythic figures that inhabit this primordial landscape. They get buried. Inglobati, you see. There's something rather like a kind of disaster, which I call the cataclysm of domesticity. And this is a church in Rome, which you can see has been somehow kind of overwhelmed. You know, there's been a terrible catastrophe. I associate it with the Anni Sancti, you see. The Anni Sancti in Rome were periods rather like boom years in the London economy, when building went mad, because a lot of money came into the city. And I imagine that at one of the Anni Sancti, this little church got completely buried in apartments to rent, you see. And what happens, you see, is that these, as it were, perfect buildings, which also have a very big scale. This one doesn't. This is why it's got overwhelmed. These perfect buildings, they just show a little vestige. You know, this is just showing its face. Everything else is covered. And this is very important. In the 18th century, they began to dig these things out. In the Enlightenment, they started to reveal them. This is a terrible mistake, as I hope to explain. So this is another example of these primordial buildings, if you like, becoming in a way buried within the city. And here you see there's a difference in scale between this kind of big hut, this big shed, you know, and all this stuff. There's a nice book by a Dane, whose name I forget, who says that these reinforcements on the corners are as if to stop the city being worn away by a kind of flood, like the reinforcements on a bridge. Now you see, the idea that you have these kind of jewel-like perfect buildings buried inside a sort of mass of pragmatic structures, runs through even into formally ordered plans. And this is a very early concept of a large building, if you like, which is Filareti, and you can see there the the formal centre. And here is Filareti again. Somehow, I've always been struck with this strange incongruity, you know, between this bit in the middle and all this mass which he's trying to organise around it. And here we are again. You see, there's this thing buried in the middle. And here is actually a piece of London. This is the College of Physicians, which is actually very close to where the building is that I'll be showing you. And I just wanted to show you again, you see, the way that this perfect building gets swallowed just shows its face, and typically also a kind of spire, some kind of evidence in the roof plane, which we'll come to. Now, this is, you may be surprised to know, this is from Corbusier. This is from the Œuvre Complète. And when Corbusier was obviously feeling a bit depressed during the Vichy period, he wrote this about his wallpaper. This was the wallpaper on his room. And actually it's from the Home of Man, it's not from the Œuvre Complète. And he says, by an odd chance, we discovered a linen print which decorated the modest office where this book was written. This lusty evocation of a golden age, an age in which chaos was banished before the birth of present covetousness, and so on and so forth, after J.B. Huet, a painter of the 18th century. So this Corb somehow kind of waxing poetic about a really crummy vision of a kind of decayed, you know, scene of classical ruins of islands and boats and all this sort of, you know, Arcadian nonsense, which we thought Corbusier, you know, he talked about the Rome of horrors. But in actual fact, my thesis is that Corbusier was just like everybody else, only, well, modern. But his intentions were given. His ambitions were given. They were completely traditional. But his technique was original and fresh. And I maintain because he said, what is wrong with cities is that you have a row of buildings at every 60 meters. And what this prevents you from doing is seeing a primordial site, you see, the site of the city that was there before the building occurred. And he said, all you have to do is levitate. All you have to do is lift the city up and put it on what he called pilotti. And that's it. I mean, that's a very, very simple idea, very captivating, and all the architects of, you know, the older generation, my generation, were completely captivated all over the world. It doesn't matter where they came from. They all believed this. Now, also something which went with this idea, which is quite interesting, he described this process, and he described this plane as the sol artificiel, which is the artificial earth. And this was always understood technologically, because in fact he created these great fat members and filled them up with pipes. But what he was really doing was reinterpreting the concept of the entablature. And you see, this is the problem of the Corbusian city. The problem of the Corbusian city is that when you lift it up, the city itself vanishes, because the site of the city becomes nature, in theory. In actual fact, it becomes a sort of car park and a terrible space. But even if it worked, you know, and it does work in some cases. I mean, you know, it does work. You can build a park and you can put the city up on stilts, but you lose the city, which is a problem. Now, this is Rome again, and what is interesting about Rome is that, as I say, first of all, the monuments are buried in the mass of the buildings and only show. And then I'll talk about the entablature later. But in fact, the entablature, if you want to understand what the entablature is, you just do the etymology of the word. It's an entablement. It's a table. It's a tablinum in Latin, which means a planked surface. It means an art gallery, and it means a list, like a table. You know, multiplication table. Tables is a taxonomy. So it's some kind of place which combines all these qualities. And in a traditional city, they've always had this concept of the cornice, which has always been explained in modern architecture as some kind of formal device of very little importance. In fact, it's of immense importance, far more importance than a mere formal line. It divides two worlds. You can see there this sort of vegetation, and this is taken from the Pincio, from the top of the Spanish Steps, and you can see this strange way in which, above this line, there's a collection of hovels. You know, roofscapes are always sort of somehow hovels. They're sort of shacks, really. They call them altani in Rome. And they're a combination of shacks on these monster buildings, which are like secondary buildings which evidence the building below. Right, this is the process of entablement, you see. And these people are specially adapted for holding tables because they only have one wing. This is the entablement of Jupiter. And you see, he's definitely another kind of person. He's doing this special thing with two arms that they've always done when they thought they were really getting somewhere. But this is a table, you see, and that's an entablement. Now, entablement again, you see, Corbusier, as one would expect with a genius, he did everything right, you know, but in his own way. And here is the Villa Savoye. Now, Banham always said that there was something strange going on here, and he compared it to the nature morte. He said that what Corbusier is doing is in some way relating to this phenomenon of the nature morte, which was then translated into this composition of abstract shapes. And what Corbusier was doing, he was entabling what he called, he was entabling his charismatic objects, you see, his Phileben solids. And he was putting them on this table, you know. And you can read, of course, a building as complex as that in many, many ways, but you can certainly read this as an entablature. Now, what Corbusier did, I talked about the sol artificiel, you see. What he did, he dropped the entablature to here, and he put everybody on top of the entablature, you see, which is a kind of modern thing to do. He put Mr. and Mrs. Everyman and their dog, whereas traditionally you would have only put kind of images, deities, concepts on top of the entablature. This is a little drawing from Pompeii. Seneca moralizes upon the unnatural custom of planting gardens upon the housetops, which enhanced considerably their value. So that is worth remembering. But anyway, you see this strange object here, which has these little bothies and the jungle. So this is an idea, you know, with a considerable pedigree. And of course, Corbusier also had a jungle up there. As we know, Corbusier had a jungle in two places. He lifted the house up and let the jungle underneath, and then he also has it as a sort of insurance policy and put the jungle on top as well. Now, if you do the etymology of the Attic story, it's very strange. We were talking about that this morning, about the mansard and the attic, this rooftop world, you see. Attic would have meant, in the 18th century at least, somehow very good, you know, and even in the 17th, it would always mean very good because it would mean Greek, you see, and it would mean original and the best and pure. So it's very strange because we think of attic stories as really the worst part, you know, of the house. So this is these drawings, in a way, derive from a kind of understanding, if you like. It's a kind of mythic, it's a sort of fictional understanding of the attic story as being the original places, you see, islands. And then there's a process, instead of a flood, of a denudation. And the city is revealed as the place which happens after the waters have departed. There are these city blocks, these islands. You see, because insulae means island. And then, so you somehow take a block and conceptually make it into a building by hollowing it out. and here is a Roman tomb, which is exactly corresponding to this idea. Although I know in fact, the vegetation on the top was intentional, as you know, because the tomb has a tumulus of earth on top. And this is another picture from Rome, which illustrates also these two levels of vegetation and of nature, which is separated by the city itself. That's another. Now this shows the street as a sort of canyon thing, and here we are, these curving streets. See, what I've always been interested in is the relationship between medieval city plans and humanist buildings. And in fact, there's somebody called Mark Jarzembek who's written a book on Alberti, and he maintains that Alberti had a deliberate plan to inter humanist buildings within the city, to actually build them and then cover them over again, so that they should seem like ruins, because he wanted to establish, as it were, a synthetic ideality, and distance it from the interference by politicians and living people, by making it seem as if it had always been there. But that's a rather interesting story. This is the skin of a snake. Streets should always be paved with the skins of snakes, you see, because the snake is the icon of water and infinity. And so this is the snake. This is my understanding of cobbles, you see. The Romans, there's a very strange thing in Roman cities. If you look at a plan of a Roman building, you'll see the building is very precise, and then outside you have these strange polygonal block, which I know are quite functional, the polygonal blocks, but nothing is ever only functional, in classicism. Everything. And so now we talk about the hyperstyle, which can be a forest or columns or blocks. It's interesting, this picture again of Corb's. He takes a very dramatic view, and he's taken this plane again, this roof plane. Again in there, he seems, he likes this roof plane. Conventional picture of the skyscraper city, you're sort of looking up at it and everything, but he doesn't. He takes the top and looks down. Well, that's the Grove. Right, the hyperstyle is a figure that what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to take you rather quickly through a kind of repertoire, which I'll bring together in the end in this building design, but I prefer to do it like this than a series of flashbacks from the building. Serlio said this is the original building. He said actually it's the original Greek building, and he said it's the Council Hall of Athens, and this is very puzzling to a functionalist, because clearly the only thing that could, as it were, talk to each other in that building is columns. So it's the Council Hall of Columns, you see. What it is really, it's a manifestation of his idea of the primordial building, of primordial architecture. Because, one of the things that modern theory has never been able to quite cope with is the importance of the column. All traditional theories of architecture focus around the column. And modernism doesn't, of course. It reverses the thing, and says the column is just a pillar, and if you can get rid of it, so much the better. So this is a sort of building which just consists of nothing but columns. I've always been very interested in hyperstyles, because a hyperstyle seems to be the most anti-functional building, because you make a room and then you entirely fill it with the biggest columns you can build in it, nothing you can do. And this Egyptian here is clearly, wondering why he has this nice room and these terrible columns inside it. Well, we'll come to the solution of that. Okay, now this is a house which consists of nothing but attic story. You see, this is a perfect house, built in. He built one house, and that's it, isn't it? Really, we'll never build another. and it's on a hill. And when I was designing this house, I used to think of putting my fingers into the top of the hill and trying to find something, you see. And I would find this sort of structure inside the soft top of the hill, you see. And in fact, it was Serlier again. He said, when you design a building, you must think of it as a series of walls which intersect, and at each intersection you have a pilaster. And then when you make the building, you take the walls away and you leave the pilasters and so on. So you must have you must have an invisible building, a sort of Platonic structure, if you like. So here is this sort of forest of fossilized columns, and here it is on the top of the hill, you see. This is the grove, and the house becomes a kind of grove with these beings. And so here's the Serlian sequence, the platform with its four corners and the walls going between. And then the columns come up and they have a belt and a head and a strange fascia, which I always thought of as sort of bandaged, a sort of kind of spiral motion, you see. Now, in fact, I always use this fascia now because to me it represents time. It represents time enclosing space. And that's one interpretation of this figure, that the snake represents time and the egg represents space. And the four corners, the house is an exercise on the 5 different kinds of really, and this is one sort. We have 4 corners which hold up the sky. And the 4 corners create the room with a vertical axis, the axis mundi, which has the window into the lowerness, the window into the upperness. I mean, this was always explained as some sort of system of collecting rainwater, which I rather hit on there. Its real function, iconographically, is to create a theatre in which the sun comes round and you see the upperness and the lowerness, and you put figures in there of the ocean. And this is an alternation between there it is, you see, it goes round and the sun shines in. The axis mundi. Okay, so this is the house, and this shows something that I learnt in the house, which is that the column you don't build is more important than the ones you do. And what happened was the whole thing is a square platform on which this game is played, and the columns that are not there, represented as a circular core, and which is made of wood on the inside of the house, and a sort of stone surround. And these are all different materials that I developed for this building that we use now: black concrete and green concrete, and stuff we call blitzcrete, which is you smash up a lot of bricks and then grind it off. It's like terrazzo, but made of bricks and concrete. The good thing about it is the colour never fades, because brick never loses its colour. And it's soft. That's the plan of the house. It's a square whose diagonals intersect in the living room. And you can see all these patterns. It's all laid out on the module of a brick, although there are very few bricks. These are the size of a brick, but they're made of travertine. And its plan is very traditional. I won't go into that. But I just want to show you something about columns, really. This is when we take a column away, we put it back in light, with a shaft of light. You see, that's a whole column. They are 90 centimeters, and you take it away and you put back a piece of marble. This is a very big column, which should be about 20 meters high. But it doesn't exist, you see. So it's put back with light again. And this is an exercise on time. It has 365, 52, 13, 12, and 24 segments. And this has 7 layers. So when you go into the house, you go into a cave, you see. And this is like the beginning of time. And there's no light except from the top. And then you go through into the living room and you look out into the valley. And this is another column. You see, this is the solution of the Egyptians' problem. You take the column away and you put it back in light, and it's very useful. And it's actually very nice. When you are sort of accustomed to the house, you walk about through very thick walls and columns that are not there. So you actually become a column, you see, because the column was originally a word, and then it was a figure, and then it was a column. This is the Egyptian cosmology. So you can actually stand in one of these things, you see, and you can really become a column. Really physically. I mean, the important thing about architecture is that it's a ritual, you know? It's more than a mythology, it's a ritual. That's to say, you physically embody ideas, you know? They actually come into being. I mean, it's very, very powerful. And that's why people are frightened of it, actually. It's just like a ritual, you know. If you undergo a ritual, you can change yourself. And it's frightening, in fact, if you really unleash the power of architecture. We only play with it. This is an Axis Mundi column with 3 rivers. When the burglar alarm goes off, all the lights come on, you see. And this is also kind of earth, and this should be water, it should be black and white marble. It is in one place, and then this is air, sort of dances about, and then this is fire, and because fire is black, you know. Not quite sure why I put that on. Oh yes, this shows how the walls are made of travertine and the columns that are not there. So you can see now this house sits on this great hill. It has nothing underneath it, you know, just has the earth underneath it. So it's like a kind of, it's like an attic story. And so when we design a city building, I put this house on top of it. So this is the attic story up there, and this is the rest of the building. I'll come to this in more detail later, but I just wanted to show you that. And here's the entablature. So the attic goes on top of the entablature, and it's a very special category of place. Right, now, this is a building we designed in the City of London, and this is its iconography. Here's the island, the insula, and this is this kind of primordial, the recapitulation of the primordial site on the roof. And this is a street called Cannon Street, which you will recognize instantly. And this is a kind of sketch of a city, you see, with this sort of building dotted about in it, which is, I mean, you see, the interesting thing is that actually, I mean, well, it's not interesting really, it's somehow you have to do it. You have to relate, you know, you have to relate your strategy to what is practical, that's to say, what is current. And in fact, this is a kind of current building type, you know. It's called ground scraper. Charles Jenks calls it the ground scraper, because it's just big and fat, you know, and it has this atrium thing in it, which nobody knows what to do with. This is my picture of the entablature, you see, because, you know, I like the word plank. I don't know why, but in my classical dictionary it says the tablinum is to do with planking, with planks, you know, thin, flat bits of wood. So here's this planking, you see. And on top of it is put vegetation and these spires and kind of mythic creatures, you see, things that fly around. Now, this is rather amusing. This is from a Norman capital. And here they've got these logs, and they've got vegetation. So there's some kind of... these are very strange, you know, kind of ancient ideas, which bubble away. And what I feel modernism is about, it's a kind of archaeology. You know, in the 18th century, they tried to find the original Doric column and the original Ionic column, and they gave up because everyone was different, naturally. No architect was going to do the same Ionic column, even in Greece. So one has to go further, you know, one just goes further and further and further and tries to, as it were, understand the whole thing in a more abstract way. So now this is another theme which we'll come to in a minute. of what I call the valley. And this is laid into the building there. And here it is again. This is the hyperstyle. And there's a figure behind it called the valley, which has a delta, a bridge, fields, it's a city, trees and mountains, and a source. Right, and this is the building that we designed it for. So when you look at that, I mean, it's really more or less a conventional building. I mean, it was a serious design in a competition. It didn't win because we made one or two mistakes, which we know about now. But it's a building with an atrium which slopes because the sun came in this way. There's a very, very long escalator because we found out that the client liked escalators. I don't know how we'd have built it. And in fact, it said, you know, if very old men get on an escalator and there's a waterfall next to it, you can get into trouble half the way up it. But this was an oil painting that I commissioned. I said to this is by an artist called Carl Lobin, who's become quite famous in England, and he just does oil paintings now. I said to him, I want you to draw the building exactly as it is, I mean accurately. You know, this is an accurate section. And then we want to exemplify the iconography. You know, we want to make the iconography literal. So that what is a river of steel, if you like, a metaphor, you know, becomes a river of water. And so this is the narrative of the valley. There's the source, there's the river, here are the fields, this is the bridge, the classical bridge, this is the delta, and this is Cannon Street. Sorry, these are a bit indistinct, the slide. And there's the entablature. And he put a Greek temple up there, or whatever it is, Tivoli or something. I mean, I let him alone, you see. I said, all right, do what you like up there. Some details. Right, now what is this valley thing? I became very interested in Claude Lorraine. And Claude Lorraine is the only landscape painter that interests me. I'm totally uninterested in country houses, which is, I think, probably why we did the best one. I'm not into country house life. And in a way, I don't like landscape paintings either. You know, I think they're wet, really. But I love Claude. I'm absolutely passionate about Claude. And the reason is that he has an iconography which is architectural. That's my explanation of it. In Claude's paintings, typically, he has a dark foreground, he's looking towards the light. And he has a certain vocabulary of objects. And, you know, again, typically there's a bridge. And on one side of the bridge, there's a fortified place. And then the protagonists are in the foreground, quite small, usually with elongated figures. Here again, you see, here's this bridge, here's this fortified tower, and then here are the protagonists, who don't seem terribly important. I mean, you know, they're not very big. And then there's a ruin here, and you can hardly see. There's a bridge down there. Actually, he very often, it's quite interesting, he very often has two kinds of bridges. Here are the buildings. There's often a bridge in the foreground, which is very rustic. I think you can just see it there. It's just made of wood and earth. It becomes a sort of game, really, trying to find the... Yes, here's the rustic bridge, you see. There we are. That's got two towers. Even in the seaport, he still has a tower and a bridge. And somewhere in the distance there's a bridge. Okay, now, you see, I interpret these metaphorically. If we go backwards, I think, probably easier. You see, a river and a road are interchangeable metaphors. And the way I interpret this is that he's looking, if you like, you can map onto this the image of a cathedral. He's looking from the apse, he's looking from the altar, you know, down. This is the west front, and these are the doors into it. And what this bridge does, it divides the region of light from the region of darkness. It divides the river begins in the spring, and then it dissipates into the delta, into the sea. And, you know, there's a experience called the near-death experience, I think it's called. And people have actually physically died after accidents on the operating table, and they report going down a tunnel into a light. And then, well, the ones that report it come back. They also levitate. They look down at their bodies from the ceiling, which is a sort of Bachelardian thing, you know. What's up there? When you take the ceiling away, you reveal the vault, and you reveal the territory of your thoughts. No, I think it's that way around. No, we're going backwards. What's happening? Yeah. Now, I've turned this into a diagram. So you can see that it maps onto a lot of different kinds of built orders. You know, this is like a country house or a palace. Here's the building. Here's the bridge. I mean, typically a bridge would be guarded by fortifications. There's a succession between pastoral and arable. These are the columns of the nave, the apse, the buttresses. And I'm sure the reason I find Claude so powerful is that I used to think, I mean, maybe it's true, I used to think that when he painted, he was kind of remapping. He was taking a kind of arc. This architecture had somehow carried something of the classical landscape across the centuries. And he was, as it were, remapping it back onto the natural world, because at that time, the natural world became the theatre of a possible perfection, if you like, of a sort of meaningful structuredness. And for a time I also thought what was interesting was that he had no vertical axis, you see. Because I thought in the cathedral, you see, you progress. There's an intersection between a horizontal narrative and a vertical narrative under the dome or under the spire. But in fact, what he's done, he's simply naturalized it, you see. He has what I call a displaced ruin. And where you have the protagonists are, in fact, in the center of the painting, but they're under the real sky. And there's a sort of ruin pushed to one side, which is, as it were, the ruin of the... It's as if he'd used up architecture and was pushing it to one side, you know. He's on the way to high-tech. That's another little diagram of it. And this is in Tivoli, in Frascati, and it's mapping on this sort of sequence. Now, this is the arc, this is the nave. It's rather a strange drawing, but I was trying to draw a brick, actually. I don't know, and then this sort of boat appeared in the middle of it. And this is the valley. This is the sign of this is the Egyptian hieroglyph for a town. And this is this thing kind of leaking out. This is the building which stands next to the house, which has this boat figure in it. And in a way, it's a kind of model of a temple, but it's all sorts of things. I mean, it was a conversion, you know, we played with all sorts of historical references and things, which I won't go into. This is a bit of technology that I thought might amuse you. This is blue concrete. It's rather rare blue concrete. It took me about 1.5 years to get my concrete man to produce blue concrete, because he says it won't last. But Bayer does a nice blue. It's very expensive, mind you. Okay. Yes, I mean, he keeps ringing me up and asking me if I've got any more of these things to do, but I don't. It was a sort of exercise, really. Right, now this is a building that we just finished designing, and it's a building in a business park, you know, which means it doesn't have any urban context. And we put into it the narrative of this valley from a kind of secret garden overlooked by a belvedere, down the stairs, which are the social focus of the building, through a hyperstyle, and out into a delta. So this is like a kind of, and then it also has a It also has these 4 rivers that come out and towers that are not there, various useful things like that. And then we did a lot of work on decoration on this. In fact, this is like a temple that's buried inside a building, except the building isn't buried in anything, because in a business park there's nothing. And the building is very hard, and the temple is very soft. In fact, it's made of paper. This is all just wallpaper, except for this. And it's a kind of inversion, because in the traditional city, the city is very soft, and the temples are made of marble. It's like mud and marble. These are narratives. We sort of superimposed an Egyptian idea of the column, which is a basket and a backbone. Those are the 2 most important hieroglyphs of the Egyptian column, on a kind of materialistic narrative of solid and liquid and gas and that sort of thing. That's the exterior, where we changed colour horizontally. We've made red corners and composed the building, because the building is just a block, but we broke it up with colour. Just coloured bricks. This is the palette of materials for the outside. So this is the concrete that's made of crushed and broken brick. And this is the materials on the inside, which is made of stencil. The stenciling is very nice because it's transparent. Each pattern you put on top, you see the other one. And this is a kind of metal cladding which would protect the bottom. This is an interesting material which is, we christened it doodlecrete because we wanted to invent a technology where you just draw a pattern and you turn it into an inlaid masonry, like marquetry or pietra dura. And this is made with plaster that is reinforced with resin. And it's very strong. It's stronger than concrete and more elastic and very controllable. So these are actually inlaid. The patterns are about 5 millimeters inlaid into the material. This material is screen printed galvanized steel. I love galvanized steel. And the cornice here, you see, the Egyptians thought the sky was a cow. So we call this the cow pattern. And this is the floor. And it's a playing with scale, really, so that when you step off these steps, you think you're going to fall into an abyss. And these are columns, and, it's all made of marble tiles. This is the pumping station, which you might have seen yesterday. And this is a rather bad copy, but you can see we laid out the floor like water. And these columns here walk into the Thames. And the way to read this facade is that these are 2 mountains which are divided in the middle with a cave, and the river comes out, this blue part here, and it runs between the rows of trees, between the mountains, and then it comes through the bridge here. This is the bridge. I mean, it's not exactly a forced reading, it's a coded reading, I mean, obviously it does a lot of other things, but we're talking about landscape this time. No. Right, now this is the site in Blackfriars. This is the beginning. This is the River Fleet, which is a tributary to the Thames. So here's the Thames, okay, all covered in trees. And this is... I always get my centuries wrong. This must be the 17th century, I suppose. But it's like the 17th century drawn from memory. What I wanted to say, really, was here was the river, and here were the houses, and it had a certain typology. The riverside had a certain typology. They were just long, thin buildings, and the boats were on the sand. And then they built the first bridge by somebody called Robert Milne, who was a Scot, and he was a pupil of Piranesi. And naturally enough, he built the bridge too heavy and it started to sink. But this was a nice picture of the opening of the bridge. And so it created the bridgehead, and the site that we're going to build on is up there. and there's a street there called Water Street. But anyway, everything was more or less the same. You just made a hole and you pulled the boat up. And then this is the 19th century, where they rebuilt the road bridge, and then they built a railway bridge. And everything on the river was more or less the same, except the railway bridge started to go up, and it cut this, and this is our site here, you see. It cut this little thing, which has stayed the same. And then St. Paul's is up here, and the age of the city is about, the old city of London is about there. And then this is the 20th century. And you can see everything on the city, on the river has completely died, which is why you're here, I'm sure. All that you have on the city is the shadow of aeroplanes, and these little boats like you were on yesterday, and helicopters. Helicopters use it as a kind of safety net, Helicopters can fall onto London in the river, but nowhere else. And for the first time, really, we had buildings that I can't draw from memory, you see, because these buildings create in the memory an area that doesn't function. There's a loss of memory, there's an amnesia. These buildings are designed by engineers and architects, and they have no typology, and so you can't remember them. So the city now begins to disappear in one's mind. This building is interesting. It's Lever House. There's a control over the height of buildings in London, and it was created by this building in the 30s, because it was built too high, they thought, and so you couldn't see St. Paul's. Now you see, what has happened in London is there's been a misunderstanding of the concept of the entablature, of the cornice. In Chicago, in about 1880, they'd reached 200 feet. And they passed a law in London that says you're not allowed to occupy a room. You can build more than 100 foot high, but you mustn't occupy the space. So they understood, you see, that you could build above the entablature, but you mustn't live up there. You see? I mean, why did they pass that law? You don't go mad if you live 100 feet, above 100 feet, but they made a prohibition. And so you see buildings built in the 1930s in which you have the base of a skyscraper and you have the top of a skyscraper, funny little thing, like the Shell building, and nothing in between. The bit that makes the money is missing. Now, do you remember? This is the little building that was left when the railway was cut through. And to give you an idea of the scale of London, I mapped. It's a pub. It's a very beautiful pub. If you have time to go into, it's one of the. There's a book published about the interiors of London, and this is maybe 30 buildings, 30 important interiors, and the interior of this pub is in it. It's quite nice, It's sort of mosaic and marble and sort of steel liberty. But anyway, I mapped this onto the Piazza di Pietra in Rome. You see the scale of London and the scale of Rome. I mean, the scale of London is small, and the English have always been very concerned about the problem of scale. But really, I don't think they have anything to worry about, really. So this is the site. It's it's a terrible site. It has a railway runs right through the building from beginning, like the backbone is a railway. It has the pub, which developers don't like, and a beer garden. And the buildings used to come to here, but in the 1960s, the road engineer demolished this part and cut it off to make the road wider. So we have a funny little garden there. Okay, now, this is what I call my 7-stage rite of city architecture. It's like a sort of, it's like kind of ritual now. It's a design ritual. So this building was bought, and so the site now of the building runs around the pub up here. So it has 2 buildings here, which are historically listed, which remain. And the first the first act, if you like, is to discover the primordial grove. And obviously this is a mythic. I mean, this is as mythic as Le Corbusier really made it, you know, because, I mean, so this is the primordial grove with its spring and its rivers and its hill. And it's like a kind of myth, it's a stage, you go through it. You then turn the grove into its cenotaph. You know, a cenotaph is a tomb that has no body in it. So it's like the tomb of a mythic hero. So this is a kind of cenotaph of a, and this is for me the meaning of the mansard roof. You know, if it has a meaning at all, apart from packing in another 2 stories of accommodation. It's some kind of pyramid or tumulus which rests on the entablature, and it has this vegetation around it, and the entablature, in our case, it rests on logs. So, and then the bit that the developer likes, which is what I call the cataclysm of domesticity, because this is what he's paying for. This is the building itself, you know. You just bury it. You put on as much as you can, you know, like Paternoster. I mean, there's some things I like about Paternoster, actually, and the density is one of them. I don't think anybody else does, except perhaps the developer. But I really like, but it should be soft, you see. That's the complete opposite of high-tech. It really is. This is as soft as you can make it. And then the next stage, so how many have we had? We've had 3, haven't we, I think? 3. Okay, the 4th stage is you sort of lay in the river. It's like a sort of folding in. You know, when you cook something, you fold it in. And you fold in the valley. Now, so here's the source, and and here's a staircase, and here is this arcade of columns, and there's the bridge, and the delta, and here's the accommodation, you see. And then, that's the last stage, that must be the 7th. We've skipped some, haven't we? Can't count, I never could. So here, oh yeah, I think I missed out, actually. The cataclysm of domesticity also includes this recapitulation of the primordial landscape on top. And then the last stage of all, you see, is the facade. Except when you build a building for a developer, all you build is the facade. And maybe the atrium and maybe the entrance hall, you know. But so the last stage is this kind of recapitulation again of a grove, but on the outside. Now you see, my theory is that when I go to a city like Rome, what I find is a very strange phenomenon. I've written a piece for the Biennale where we're exhibiting, and the first line says, in the future it will be desirable to occupy cities that do not exist. And what the history of the Western city is a kind of history of building these great machines and then designing them in such a way that they are invisible. I mean, the city that moves, the walking city, the city made of glass, the city which is full of motion, you know, which is, I mean, the monorail is emblematic, you know, is emblematic of escape. And the garden city. There's always a kind of anti-city built into this great mechanism. And the bigger the mechanism, the more necessary the anti-city. Now, this proposition is all about the failure of Camillo City. You know, Camillo City, he analyzed the medieval humanist city. They fascinated him. And he made a very good analysis of them. And he said all sorts of interesting things, like the churches are never in the middle, the statues are never in the middle of a space, they're always pushed to one side. And then he ended his book by saying, but I can't use any of this, you know? The modern sensibility is incapable of creating these things ever again, which was a bit disappointing. But I think it is, you see. I think it is capable of creating, it is capable of creating something which works in the same way. I mean, obviously it's not going to be the same, but it's capable of creating it. And the way it works, I think, is that when you have streets that are crooked, you can't look down them. Now, in the 18th century, with Enlightenment, you see, I say, you go to a modern city, and what do you see? Everything. You know? End of story. I mean, when you go to a medieval city, you're irritated, you know, and you begin to use your imagination. You can't see anything, you know? Your eye is always blocked, and the eye is the most powerful organ. The eye goes straight to a gestalt, you know, to an order. If you deny the eye, then the inner eye, the imagination, starts to work. If you bury inside the mass of the city perfect buildings which have this sort of primordial pedigree, what I think happens is in your imagination you literally dig away the whole city. You make it disappear. And in your imagination, I mean, I retain an image of Rome which is like the maps of it when there were more cows than people in Rome, you know? At the time of the papacy in Avignon, Rome was a ruin, populated by these great things. And if I did a plan for a city, a whole city, I would have an underground system that came up in the cathedrals, because you would then understand that city in terms of its monuments. You would just have a memory, a map of it, you see. Because anyway, that's a joke really, but it's not a bad one. What happens in these cities is you try and imagine when you've gone into all the churches, when you've gone into all the atria, you remember them. You remember how perfect they were, and then you come out in the streets and it's all terrible. The streets are crooked and it's a kind of mess, really. And you just try to imagine the place. You try to sort of dig away all the buildings that have buried the good buildings, because you want to imagine them. Now, in the 18th century, they dug them away, you see, and they blew it. Because, in fact, all you see is the back of the nice building, you know. So what? Who cares? Now, the importance of the rooftop vegetation is that it creates a series of clues. If you dig away this, if you dig away the mass of the city in your imagination, the rooftop gives you a clue as to what you could, as it were, put around the monuments. And as it were, it sort of sinks down onto this primordial site that Le Corbusier wanted to lift the city and look under, you know. I think you just can't lift a city. You destroy the city, so that's the end of that. I mean, you know, it's not a sort of efficient strategy, you know. It just doesn't work. But you can cover a city in roof gardens. I mean, that is technically credible, you know, and therefore you can, as it were, create this clue, and you can populate it with images, with thoughts, with concepts. The other part, which I haven't shown you, is the painting on the ceilings. You see, if you put enough paintings on the ceilings, they act like magic lanterns, and they actually project into the sky what you see in them. And there's a fusion between what you see in the paintings and what you put on the roofs. They become a kind of a conceptual landscape, a conceptual territory, which begins to interact with these buried volumes. And finally, as I say, the last act of the technique is to surround them with another series of clues. And in a way, this is what... There is a problematic in the modern city simply because the spaces are bigger, you know? The roads are bigger. So I find that in the traditional city, the facades can be quite laconic. They don't have to have much energy. But in the modern city, as the spaces get bigger, the game becomes more dangerous, and the facades have to get more active. So here's the railway, which is going down into the building. Now you see, we began by making holes to see the railway, you see. And then it was rather fortunate because the railway said to us, well, we have a problem. We have something called casual derailment. Casual derailment, I mean, you know, the train just leaves the rails. And they said, if you have these holes, it's possible the train might come out like when you cut carrots. It just sort of gets destroyed. So they wanted the holes filled up solid. And that's a lesson, you see, in high-tech. Technology doesn't exist for architects to make it pretty. You know, technologists have very serious problems, and making it look nice is not one of them. What happens when the conjunction of techne and image come together is that techne is transformed into image. What happens to the train? It becomes swallowed in this great long building, and it turns into a carriage. You see? There's an image of a carriage here with wheels. I mean, these wheels are for ventilation. It's a kind of joke, really. And what happens to these things? They become windows into... I mean, these are just Mythological plates, you know, because we don't have time to develop all these things. But they become windows. So this is the carriage. Remember these things? These are ventilation things. This is a bit of Piranesi down there. I'll explain a bit more about the facade in a minute. A slight digression about the column. This is, if you like, you know, how the client sees the building. This is how the engineer sees it, and this is how the services engineer sees it. And the high-tech stops here, and this is how I see it. And all these fit. This fits into that. That fits into this. This fits into that. And these columns, we've christened these the robot column. You know, robotnik. They're worker columns, and they're filled with machinery. You can walk into them, which is nice, and these columns are full of machinery, and the physical support is seen simply as a piece of machinery. It has no architectural presence. That's to say, I distinguish between column and pillar, if you like, or prop. I call these anti-gravity props. You see, these steel columns have no presence in our architecture because they're not enough, you know, they're insufficient. I mean, the whole point about steel is that it's strong. That's the only important thing about it. This is interesting. In a mirror, you can complete these columns. And this is interesting. This is Le Corbusier's building, you see. Le Corbusier reduced the building to the domino. And this is his sol artificiel. This is his fat legs, you know. And we join the fat legs onto the concrete building, and we swallow it, and it disappears, and just as well. And this is what happens when you put the services in the wall, in these columns. You can see here's the support. It's now an object of secondary importance. Primary importance is services. But the whole thing has a purely technical existence. What matters is it when it's transformed into image. But one of the good things about putting all the stuff in the wall is that the ceiling is liberated. And this is a ceiling to a building we designed, which is exposed. And the function of that is as a thermal store. But having exposed it, you can paint things in there, you see. So it can be a painted ceiling, coffered. And also it functions. We have an EEC grant of 350,000 for this building because in various ways we've transformed the building using these sort of techniques. so that it becomes a thermally massive building, and the heat is absorbed into the ceiling. Right. Now this is the end, this is the pub, there's St. Paul's, moved slightly, and this is the part that was demolished and now it's rebuilt. So what we've done, we've taken the building and sliced it like that, haven't we, you see? So that's a trick which you use when you want to reduce the scale of something. This building almost looks taller because this is always made of small pieces. There's the entablature, and inside there is the temple, you see, and this is like telegraphing the temple. In fact, we would have a door in there, but this was done at a stage when we hadn't demolished the building behind it, so this was a wall. I still rather like it as a wall, actually. And this shows how it relates to the existing buildings. Right. Now, the iconography of the order, of the column, starts to recapitulate the design ritual of these logs and things like that, and the two kinds of Egyptian column, the basket and the backbone, but then it transforms into a cube. Now this is the story of the phoenix, which is something else, and these are these logs which have faces on, and this is it transformed into a facade. You see, you just cut it, and there's a creature on the top. This is the technology that we invented. So this is taking it a stage further from breaking the brick. You now cut the brick, and you cast it into concrete, and then you machine it, and then you put a stainless steel strip, so that the whole building, what I try to do is I try to make buildings which have mass but no weight. It's an important distinction for me, because weight is concerned with function, you see, and it reminds me of French rationalism, which I absolutely hate. But I like buildings that are massive and soft. So this is as if the whole building has come apart, and there's a light inside which is shining out through this. So the building is, as it were, blowing apart, but hanging in midair, but solid. And so these are all, this is the size of a brick. And this is one of the windows. And one of the mistakes that functionalism makes about windows is that, they hope that by function you can make a window interesting. Well, you never can. So a window really is this is really the least interesting part of the building. The interesting part is the wall. And we use the wall to again recapitulate the narrative of the valley. And so at the top we have the sun in the day, and then that's the sun at night. So that has recalled the idea of the whole earth. And then in the middle you have the river. That's made of cast glass, which is very cheap material, ashtray technology. And then on either side there's the mountains, which is the white and black marble, and the trees, which are black and green, because black and green are the colors of vegetation. And then here, so that's the entablature, you see. The entablature there is again the landscape placed above on the table. And then holding up that are the columns, which are a discussion about a blue there. I paint that blue because, you see, the columns now are empty. The ancient Egyptians, the columns were filled with people. They were bodies, you see, but now the column is empty. I mean, we can put things into it. It's like a kind of box. And I put machines into it, you know. I turn it into a robot. I'd want a column that walks about, actually. And then this is yellow because the column is also a shaft of light, again because it's empty. And this is this material narrative to do with earth and vegetation, with water coming up. Here's the bridge. And this is that delta. Remember the delta, which is a triangular thing. And the delta is coincided with the hyperstyle. which is the field of reeds of the Egyptians again. And these are some of the materials on the pumping station, which is white concrete and paint. The capitals are always very brightly coloured, because you see the capital is just like the head. It's where it's more or less pure thought. When you paint something, you destroy its materiality. So you destroy its physicality, and in a way it's kind of it's physical functionality. You change from physical functionality into iconographic, iconotectics, iconotectonics, if you like. So that's why these are quite brightly coloured, but I still show a little material anyway, because I have a kind of materialist fear of ideas. These are just details. This is where the column gets fatter. There's a copper thing. And these are little windows. One of the reasons for this diagonal pattern is so you can put windows in these big columns. And I quite like this way of dividing a window, because first of all, it's quite practical. You open the bit in the middle and you clean all around. But secondly, it makes the window interesting because it produces a plan, you see, of the ideal building, which consists of this interior volume surrounded with rooms. You know, an elevation, you see, an arch has always been understood as a structural device, but it's also an iconographical device. It's actually the plan of the building rotating to elevation. So you can see that the building is a cave. This is this cloud pattern. This is an interesting pattern. You see, this is... When I was investigating the entablature, I found out that it was called the geison in Greek. And I thought, oh, this is good, because ge is the root of earth. But it's also... It's actually doesn't really mean that, unfortunately. It means boundary, geison. It means the age. But anyway, this is the earth being carried by the sky. So that's the cloud pattern. And this is a nice pattern because you can't divide it anywhere. It's somehow irrational. All these pieces interlock. This is the propeller. This propeller is 3% physically efficient and 97% architecturally efficient. It's a little oversized. So up on the entablature we have... we just made these mythic figures. You see, the thing is, what we're trying to do is obviously explore a territory that more or less died. I don't know when it died. I mean, it's been dead for years, you know. And we have we have some projects that we can put some energy into these things. But to actually design the iconography for these sort of things is going to need quite a bit of time. So, this is a strange figure here, and this is a reference to the Daleks, really, a mechanical figure. There's a thing called a hippocamp, which is a horse with a fishy tail, and it always carries a woman. This woman has got the little horse, and I call her more camp than hippo. And this is a picture of the long side of the building, where we have these propellers which are actually ventilating and these ones which are not. Because the train is going down like that, you see. And there's some more of these elements. Right, and this is the last slide, which shows death on wheels in two different guises. And this is a picture I drew about 10 years ago, and I could never understand it. And I think what it means is that, see, when we build, you know, this is in a way my high-tech past catching up with me, you see. When we build, the buildings we do are becoming more and more technological. And that's to say, more and more inescapable. You know, we can't demolish. Well, I mean, you can't demolish an atomic power station. You have to just entomb it, don't you? And in many ways, we we are becoming enslaved, you know, because of the technology of our buildings, and we want to escape from them. And this was a sort of early version of escape, you see. There's something numinous in the sky in one's imagination, which is trying to tear this physical structure out of the ground, you know. You're trying to sort of tear it off so that you can escape from it, you can destroy it. And what I'm really interested in is a more sophisticated, if you like, one which uses something you might call psychodynamics. You know? The imagination is our most powerful organ. And I don't think we know how to use it in architecture. And it's necessary. I mean, I call what I try to do iconographic engineering. It's a kind of joke. But at the same time, it's sort of serious, because it sounds frightening, but I think we have to be able to know what we're doing, you know, when we design something like a city, because we're obviously completely incapable of designing cities anymore. And my own enterprise is to try to arrive at really quite a reasonable and rational method, you know, which is invested with as much understanding as possible of how to make cities that are as good as the ancient cities. Thank you very much.
Iconography, which goes with memory, so essentially, especially in classical times, had such powerful meaning to do with the social hierarchy, or depending on how it was applied in buildings, it had a lot of meaning to people on the street. Do you think that iconography and that memory is so lost now that iconography has to be either very heavily reinterpreted or...
Well, I don't know whether anything is ever lost. It's funny, you know, ideas get lost, but we haven't lost our pancreas, you know, or our toes. I think it's possible to recover. And if a thing can be recovered, it can be used. It's a question of desire, it's a question of need. But clearly at the moment, yes, you can't, I mean, people don't walk out and recognize things. But, I mean, that isn't a reason for not developing them. If you need something, you develop it. You know, and the question that the line that I follow is based upon a perceived need. I think we need ideas like these. And I think they do work. And they could be developed, you know. I mean, I can't see any... I mean, I take your point, they don't work now, you know, but I don't think that's an argument for saying that they could never work or that they shouldn't be developed.
I wonder if what you're trying to suggest is that, I mean, I said at the beginning when I introduced you that your vision was of a representation of nature is very powerful, but it's also very personal. And I think this is a problem, isn't it?
Well, at a certain level it's personal, but at another level, I find, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Everyman recognize things in my buildings which they recognize, you know. They may not recognize everything I've talked about today, but they recognize enough to find them recognizable. And they recognize them in ways which are like a good read, you know. They can just accept them. What they don't, of course, but then I mean, any postmodern building is recognizable, if you like. You know, it's got a sort of bump in the middle and a hole in the front. The question is one of architectural culture, really. Does architecture matter? You know, We don't have a popular architectural culture or even a very recherche architectural culture. We just have a lot of sort of vague talk about, one thing or the other. But if our culture ever decides that architecture matters, then it will develop an architectural culture. Then it'll make it mean something. And I suppose all I've done really is to rehearse various traditional structures, like entablature and hyperstyle, this sort of thing. They're pretty accessible. They're in all the books, they're in all the buildings. It's just that one could learn them at school. I'm sure one could write a nice little textbook about the hyperstyle and what it does. It's a question of whether our culture... You see, buildings are big things and therefore, designed by Big Brother, created by Big Brother. And that's one of the reasons why they're bland. Is, people are apprehensive about Big Brother.
That's what I was thinking when you made the comment that your work is perhaps personal. What's the option to personal institution?
Yes, I don't think there is an option, not now. I'm afraid we're in the hands of geniuses. Well, it's a desperate condition, actually. Paternoster is an example of trying to find a kind of pre-existing, tradition and language and meaning. And it's all there, The strange thing about the Paternoster exhibition, I couldn't tell who designed what, apart from, everything else. But that's what struck me as rather strange. I couldn't recognize, and they're all sort of, recognizable architects. I couldn't tell which bit had been done by Terry Farrell and I found that quite odd, actually. It should be possible, though, to establish a more abstract level of architectural language or architectural understanding, grammar, syntax, discourse, which allows any architect to express, and be different. Why do we all speak different languages? We want to be different. So everybody wants to be different, up to a certain point. And
aren't you dealing with this in some way? This problem that seems to have recurred since the 17th century. Of I think Wren made it and Perrault made it. The distinction between constituent universal beauty and arbitrary beauty. And there's been a struggle to somehow put aside the arbitrary and seek the universal. And this led, as you pointed out before, first of all to a search for primordial origins, and then to a search for primordial geometries, primordial structures, something that wouldn't be purely arbitrary or personal or sensational. Now, you seem to be also seeking something universal or universalizable in archetypal elements of the landscape and in certain kinds of archetypal structures like the hyperstyle. And yet there still comes a point of translation from the hieroglyph into the building which seems irreducibly arbitrary.
yes, I think that's pretty... if we could establish... yes, I think that's absolutely right. The thing that I quarrel with about most of modernism is their pursuit of the archetype of geometry. The Italians, for example, I went to a symposium with Italians, and it's very strong in Italy, the establishment of geometry as this primordial landscape. of geometric forms, and that is the, as it were, the orbis, that invests their orbis. My orbis is, I suppose, something given. It is, I suppose, it is really nature. It's landscape, but it's also something to do with. You see, there are figures in the landscape. It's very important that it's not just a jungle. There are figures in the landscape, and the figures are our thoughts, and the figures are our nature, and they are, they're the psychodynamics. That's where myth comes in, and ritual, and fantasy. And there are no figures in the. There are no figures in the Italian landscape now. The landscape of pure geometric forms doesn't have us in it anymore. You see, or animals, or birds, or and it doesn't have actors. It doesn't have drama. I mean, the landscape is only one stage. The ultimate stage is when you dream about it. When you actually enter it at the deepest level. And what I think is really fascinating about Rome is I think more strongly in it. I've written a novel about a lost visual language called optogarble. And optogarble is learnt by children in this culture before the age of 5, you see. And with optogarble you think strongly, and with imagery you think strongly. You may not think, it's a sort of deeper level of thinking. It's not science. It's not exact. But it's very important. You can't abolish it. And a city made like I've described is a good place to think. It's not just for fun. I mean, it is fun, but it's really, it makes your imagination work, and therefore when you're dealing with even a rational problem, the imagination, Husserl says that when geometry desensitizes space, because when you calculate space, your senses depart. But at the same time, when you're faced with a really difficult problem, your senses come back, and your imagination batters at it. So it's very important to have a sophisticated imagination. And what this kind of city does, it develops a sophistication in the imagination, because it's articulated and it's developed into all these myths and structures. And that, I think, is its real function, in any world, and particularly in ours, which is so dependent upon thinking. It's a thinking machine. It's a machine à penser.
You said that ritual can change you quite intrinsically. How much of your original experiences and your original life, different lives that you've had, can seep through to what you design now?
Well, I suppose they all have in a way, but I haven't. That house I designed did change people who lived in it. And I mean, it changed them in a way that they welcomed. Although, if I'd said at the beginning, this is going to change you, and can even ruin you, they might have been disturbed. But it happens over a length of time. But a sort of, I mean, they sort of have to live up to that house, and they enjoy doing it, actually. Fortunately, they have the money to do it as well. But it has changed them. And I mean, I'm designing a Faculty of Business Studies in Cambridge, and I do sort of intimate, they live in a real pit at the moment, and they've been hit by a lot of money, and they're going to have a great new building. It's going to change them, and they're going to look back at their pit and say, oh, I remember those nice days. But
Is their pit more primordial than what you're going to build for them?
oh, their pit is a real pit. It's just terrible. No, it's just awful. No, it's not primordial at all, really. I don't know what it is. No, primordiality is a rather sophisticated idea. It has to be worked towards.
I was thinking more the ritual of your architectural training, maybe.
Yes.
And how you may still be plucking ideas from your childhood experiences, from your flying
Yes.
days.
Well, it must be all in there in any designer, mustn't it? I mean, I've never drawn a line and said, I'm going to change, except when I left the Air Force. The most boring thing about aeroplanes is flying them. No, I mean, it must be in any designer that it must be all in there. But what are you trying to ask me? I don't quite understand what it is you're trying to ask me.
Well, I was just wondering where your inspirations came from, basically, I suppose.
Ah. Well, Rome is a very important city for me. If there's a city that really I learned from, it's Rome. And I didn't learn from it. It was the experience of Rome. It wasn't Rome, you see, that's what encourages me about, not being able to understand iconography. You don't have to understand a film to enjoy it, or to get a lot out of it, And you don't have to understand classical mythology to get a lot out of a painting. Because that's why people paint it, really. It's to get at you. They want to communicate. But what it is, the problem is, you see, when you're a professional designer, you have to try and understand what you're doing. People of a slightly older generation than mine were extremely wary of this. They thought it would in some way emasculate them. Maybe it's true. I don't think it is, actually. I think what I do, one thing that may be interesting about the way I do it is I definitely move from medium to medium. That's to say, translation is a very important process for me. When I'm stuck, I write. Or when I'm stuck at writing, I draw. Or when I'm stuck at drawing, I design. So that the act of translation always seems to work. It always releases what it is that I'm trying to understand. And the whole process started for me, actually, when it was, like a lot of things, they're accidents. I did my first 2 buildings, which were great big warehouses. I went and talked about them in Scotland, and somebody in the audience said, why do you tell us all these things about these really boring buildings? But the point was, you see, that I tried to sort of get these buildings published, it would take me about 5 years to do these wretched buildings. And I took various editors. They kept, of the Architectural Review, they kept actually retiring these editors. I went through 3 editors of the Architectural Review. And I got kind of tired, you see, because I realized that they didn't have time, you see, to understand these buildings. And I knew there was a lot in them, but I couldn't explain them, you see. I wanted to do drawings because I like Corb's drawings, and I like the drawings that you find in the margins of Alberti, and I like woodcuts, like in the Hypnerotomachia. Little drawings, but strangely powerful. And I couldn't do these drawings, you see. I kept doing small working drawings. And then I said, oh, this is hopeless, I can't communicate with these people. So I'm going to reproduce my 2 buildings in words. So I sat down, it took me about 6 months, and I sort of wrote an essay on each building, and I sort of reproduced it, I wrote, and then I found that in this text there were visual metaphors, like the entrance hall is as if carved out of a layer of chalk and wood, like a sandwich layer of chalk and wood. So I draw a cave made of layers of chalk and wood, you see, and suddenly I was making the drawings from the text of the building. And then I found I could take some of these drawings a bit further, they became a bit more pictorial. They moved from their original visual metaphor, and then I could write a little myth about 7 of these drawings. And these are published in AA Files number 2 in an essay called warehouse, word house, picture house. And then after that, I wrote a sort of synthetic essay about the genesis of the city, which was like a fiction. And then it had started, you see. Then I wrote a novel in which I took all these ideas through about 7 different kinds of urban landscape. And now it's going on, you see. I can do drawings and texts. But that process of the 3 media is really important.
Allied to that is your research and development. I imagine you're in a little garage in Fulham somewhere, knocking up bits of people.
Oh, these concretes I managed to get other people to do. But there is a guy who is very good at it, who I've followed around for about 15 years. And yes, he's good at concrete.
Well, I thought you made a great fist competing with someone else who's also trying to soften up the city out there in the street. I don't think I've ever listened to a lecture in this room and not had a pneumatic drill in the street to put up with. But I'd like to thank you very much for doing that.
Collect up on